listing 4 of the artists who are featured in Bronze from the McClung Museum upstairs. If you haven't seen the exhibit, please do take a moment to come back and slowly spend some time in there. There's so much to look at. Or feel free afterwards to take a moment to look at some of the pieces as well. But basically, our format today, and again, sorry that we're so awkwardly far away from the artists. We don't want to have the light in our eyes. Fortunately, we had such a good turnout that it felt a little bit too crowded to be in the exhibition space itself. So we're here, and we sort of have some of the pieces up here on a PowerPoint, so hopefully we'll be able to draw those up. But we wanted to bring artists and museum staff together today to talk about the exhibit because it's a really unique exhibit. If you haven't seen it yet, what it basically consists of is 27 contemporary print artists who have responded to objects from our permanent collection. And you have both an extraordinary diversity of objects from our own collections which reflect the interesting nature of the McClung Museum and being a university museum itself. And then you have an extraordinary variety of artists from working in different mediums, but all making prints and from an extraordinary variety of backgrounds. And hopefully we'll get at some of that today. I didn't introduce myself, but my name is Kat Steinberg, and I'm one of the curators of the exhibit. Sid Cross, who is an artist that's in the exhibit, is a co-curator, and unfortunately not with us today, but again, we're lucky to have these artists who I will now introduce to you, and then we'll have a series of questions, just an informal discussion, and then afterwards we'll leave some time so that you all can ask questions of the artists as well. So I'll begin with Tanja Softic, who has nodded at me, she can raise her hand too, who is currently a visiting artist here at UT. We're very excited to have her here today. It was really nice serendipity that her visit fell in the middle of the show. And I hope that some of you all had a chance to attend her talk last week, or that you'll get the chance to meet her this week as she works with a lot of students and professors on campus. She currently lives and works in Richmond, Virginia, where she's a professor of art at University of Richmond. And she studied at the Academy of Fine Arts at the University of Sarajevo and earned her MFA there in printmaking, earned her MFA in printmaking from Old Dominion University in Virginia in 1992. She works across the media of printmaking, drawing, photography, and book arts, and in her own words, she, quote, explores questions of cultural belonging, hybridity, and memory. And I think you'll find that in her piece upstairs as well. She's received many prestigious grants, including the Pollock Krasner Grant, the National Endowment for the Arts, / Southern Arts Federation Visual Artist Fellowship, and the Soros Foundation Open Society Institute Exhibition Support Grant, and has participated in print projects and received awards too numerous to really recount today because I want us to talk. So welcome and thank you for being here. And then many of you all will recognize Beauvais Lyons, who is a Chancellor's Professor and currently the Ellen McClung Berry Professor of Art, and UT's award-winning printmaking department. We're lucky to have all of the professors from UT's printmaking department here today with us, who also have work featured in the show upstairs. He received his MFA from Arizona State University in 1983 and works in a variety of mediums, but as you probably know, has especially focused on academic parody, the documentation of imagined cultures, and the interrogation of folk art, science, zoology, medicine, and history. And he notes, because again, I'm more interested in what artists say about their work sometimes, no offense, than all of their amazing accolades, that he prefers the facsimile to the original and the imaginary to the real. I believe history is a work of fiction. He too has had his artwork in many, many shows across the US and also has won numerous awards, including some of the same ones that Tanja has, and has his works in many collections, including the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, and the Nelson Atkins Museum. And then Althea, who can also raise her hand. She is also a printmaking professor here on campus. She received her Master of Arts in Printmaking and Painting from Purdue in Indiana, and her MFA in Printmaking from the Tyler School of Art at Temple University in Philadelphia. Her prints and sculptures use hair as well as clothing, jewelry, and other fashion accessories to explore ornamentation. And she's particularly interested, as you can see in her work upstairs, with hair texture, style, and color, as well as its cultural associations. She's exhibited internationally and here in the U.S. as well. And she's been an artist in residence at the Frank Lloyd Wright School, the University of Hawaii at Hilo, and the Vermont Studio Center. And then finally, last but not least, Koichi Yamamoto, who is an associate professor of printmaking here at UT, who received his MFA from the University of Alberta in '99, and also studied at Bratislava Academy of Arts and the Poznan Academy of Art, and using what he calls layers of line and fold creates crafted landscapes and works that explore time, scale, and motion. Although that seems like an understatement of what you do. His work has also been featured in many, many exhibitions and various competitions worldwide. So without further ado, I think we can launch immediately into one of the first questions that I dropped on the ground here, that I think really will get us started sort of thinking about the use of the museum space by these artists, which of course is very exciting to me. But can each of you speak about how you navigated the relationship of form or material and content in your objects that you chose from our collections and then in your print? And maybe we can start from left to right, and then you can interject whenever you want to. And again, we're keeping it informal, so.
Okay.
Koichi.
Well, my criteria for the search for the image through this material in the museum, a lot to do with impact. I was looking for some image that has a strong impact, and then symmetry has a lot to do with it. And also, it's kind of comical figure. That was kind of my first interpretation. I really didn't know the background of this object. And I thought it was quite a funny looking thing. So it was an attraction. And then, so therefore, it was relatively easier for me to approach to it. But knowing, after finding out what actually it is supposedly these are the figure made in Indonesia, it's in Papua New Guinea area, and after the family member passed away, and then they create this figure to keep in the family. So it wasn't really funny as what I intended.
Well, for my piece, I chose to work with this image of Mississippian crinoid. And crinoids are, when they're alive, they're commonly called sea lilies, even though they're not plants, they're animals. And so I was immediately drawn to the image. People who know my work know that I sort of like to work with natural forms that have some sort of a character to them, choreography, if you will. And so as I was doing a little bit of research into the sea lilies, I was coming across the images that were these wonderful, open, flowing images, and then when I would get to images of fossils, and by the way, fossils testified that there was a sea there once, because the crinoids only live in the salt water. I was just struck by the difference between this image that looked like a fist almost, something that has kind of curled into itself, and decided to juxtapose it with this image on top, which is something more related to, it's not an image of crinoid, it's actually an image of Queen Anne's lace, really. So another plant as its opposite, and as something that I work with quite a bit lately is the Greek mythology. Anyone who knows anything about Greek mythology knows that it's a very confusing thing, and that no character in it fulfills one purpose. They're both gods and demons, and so in a way, I wanted to have this, two ways of existing of a natural object, living and dead, in it. So that's what I chose.
I chose a Victorian era hair necklace, and these necklaces are oftentimes referred to as mourning jewelry. And those of you that know my work or have some familiarity with my work know that I predominantly use hair in my own work. I've always been interested in the symbolism of hair as a symbol of both beauty, of culture, of differences or difference, and assimilation. And so it was really quite natural for me to pick something that was of the similar, of a material of interest of mine. But I've done a lot of research of Victoria era jewelry, and it's one of those things that always just intimidated me tremendously because it is so skillfully, beautifully, elaborately done, and so being intimidated, I wanted to. I felt like one of the best ways to respond was to be able to create an object myself that was much like this memento, much like something that is intended to have the same type of sentimentality itself. So I wanted to create it, and I wanted to create it myself. And so I the best way that I would know how I would do that would be to crochet it. So I crocheted this series of strands of hair to create an object first. And then I was able to use that object then to translate it into the nature of, into the print using lithographic processes. But I think for me the real interest in the object and then also in then creating the object comes from really the value that I see in the value of the necklace as being one that was created for really to encapsulate or to memorialize a loved one, right? So it has tremendous value, not just in its like skill, but really in its purpose. And so that's what I find the most interest in picking an object.
I think I want to supplement what Kat said about the process of artists selecting the work, because last year the McClung celebrated its 50th anniversary, and there was a series of 50 objects for 50 years, and that served as the starting point for a collection that ended up being 150, 200 objects that was put into a drop box for the artists to look at. So it was interesting to see how the selection process unfolded, and people ranked their selections 1, 2, 3, and sometimes people selected the same one, and there was a sort of sorting process. In the case of Deborah Cornell, she wanted to use 2 objects, so the museum was kind enough to let her combine those 2 influences to make her print. Among the objects that was on that list was the print by John Gould, and I was lucky enough to come to the museum and study the Goulds the last few years, because I did a series of prints that were modeled after the Goulds. But I thought, these are so wonderful, I've already done some of this, and I think I'll let someone else take that. And so it was nice to see Dennis O'Neill respond to that one. I chose the unusual Italian satyr goatman picture because my first training as an artist was in pottery, and I've always loved drawing vessel forms. There's just something really seductive about the volume of that kind of form. So, and then also, of course, thematically it related to some of my interest in hybridity, animal to animal, animal to human. And so I imagined a new provenance for this object. And so I was lucky enough, some of the artists weren't able to come to the museum, and I learned that there's a collection of several hundred pictures in the McClung Museum.
More than several hundred.
Okay, over 1,000? Okay. 2,000 pictures. And when I first saw the picture of this, I imagined it being like this tall. Of course, then it's like this tall. But it was interesting to think about the context of that collection, and to think that there was a picture the curator showed me of the house on Luttrell Street where this woman lived, which was festooned with shelves of these pictures before they came to the McClung Museum. So imagining histories for objects is really very much at the center of my art. When you think of those histories, I just want to make a new one up. So I invented Goatman pottery, and since this one was presumably from Italy, I made Goatman pottery in Rome, Georgia, in roughly the same period. So that explains why I chose the object and why I used it. It sort of launched this invention of this whole pottery that will produce such wares. So.
Well, and I think that what Beauvais was just saying sort of gets at probably what I should have noted before, which is how the exhibit actually came about, and that's something I think we should pause and talk about for a brief moment. But this was an idea that Beauvais approached me with some time ago, probably about a year and a half ago, and you know, the basic idea was, okay, well, there's the Southern Graphic Print Council International Conference that's going to be going on here in March, and it's going to bring several thousand printmakers to Knoxville, which is amazing in and of itself, and there'll be lots of printmaking shows around town. But he had suggested this really unique show here, and I'm also very interested, he probably knew this, in the history of museums and collecting, and in artists interrogating the museum space, and sort of artists acting as archaeologists or anthropologists, as you will, of the museum space. So as soon as he said it, I was like, yes, this is a dream show, this sounds amazing. And so we didn't want to put a lot of parameters on what the artist came up with in the end. In fact, no parameters at all other than the print size. And some people didn't even stick to that completely. So I found out when we were collating the
But they all fit in the box. So.
They all fit in the box, though. And other than that, we wanted to give them a really weird variety of objects from our collections. I think personally, maybe not everyone on staff felt the same way. I wanted to make sure that we had objects that were available for the artists to choose that were both sort of the treasures that are on permanent display in the museum, but also some of the hidden objects that would never ever get displayed. This goat picture probably being maybe one of those, because I think what that again then speaks to is the odd nature of collecting in museums. I think we grow up thinking, well, you go to school and you go to museums and you receive the truth and facts with a capital T and a capital F, and then what happens is you start working in museums and you realize that oftentimes what you have there is very much dictated by what a couple of collectors might have been interested in this case, pictures. And so maybe next, what we could sort of talk about then, I think it's a good launching point for sort of just in general this notion of the museum as a muse for artists. There's certainly a long tradition of that we don't need to lecture on right now. We actually have a lecture coming up later on in the school year that will be on that. But just sort of the role of the museum in your own work, and specifically the university museum, and sort of what that process was like working on this project. And anyone who wants to chime in can. We don't have to go in order if you all don't want to.
Well, I think it'd be interesting to hear from Tanja, because she's just recently written a wonderful photo essay on the museum's Sarajevo. And I mean, it's interesting to consider that the museum as a public repository. I mean, that's very much central to Charles Wilson Peele's idea of the museum. I mean, here's someone who we used in the frontispiece, and we were lucky enough to get permission to alter this image to include scenery from the McClung Museum, but also we added a bow tie as a tip of the hat to Jeff Chapman. And this was wonderfully designed by B.J. Allenbauer, one of our graduate students. But I mean, this represents, I think, the museum as a kind of public formalization of the earliest museum, which is the Wunderkammer, right? The Cabinet of Curiosities. And I think that there's a public trust in the, this repository and place of collection of culture, history, scientific information. So in Peele's case, I mean, he was a painter, portrait painter of the fathers of our country, but also a naturalist. And so the case of Sarajevo and its institutions is a really interesting one, because there's been eroding of the infrastructure that makes that kind of thing possible. So.
Right. As I was, museums are something that I have always been very interested in. I've grown up in museums, actually. My mother was a curator in the Museum of Literature and Performing Arts in Sarajevo, where I have written many a homework sitting on the floor, by her desk. And so being in the archives, and on the other hand, I guess this has something to do with my image. My father was a cancer researcher. So these are two of my ideas of what's beautiful and what's important in the world, stuff that I war in Bosnia, 1996. Some people are aware that the National Library has been shelled and burned to the ground. The equivalent of Library of Congress was gone in the war. 3 million books have burned. That was not the fate of Sarajevo's museum, but post-war poverty and also Western mandate for privatization of everything has done its toll. So museums the state museums are entirely not funded by the state, and for various other political reasons that I'm not going to be getting into right now. But to think about museums as a construct and someone that's almost like a luxury, in Sarajevo, because there are no museums, period. And being aware that there are children growing up in Sarajevo that don't have access to these places where I have worked in a very large version of McClung Museum, our natural history museum. I used to, as a teenager, when my parents would make me angry, or when something would make me angry, there was a problem with a boy or something like that, their courtyard and the museum itself for me was a place of solace, place where I was left alone, with a book or a sketchbook. So it's a very personal, issue for me, but I decided to make that essay in Sarajevo about Sarajevo. And by the way, if you go on my website, you can, this is a piece of shameless self-promotion, you can find the essay on the sidebar. It says Sarajevo's institutions in crisis. I decided to work on this. I decided that this is something I have to do, even though this was my very first foray in anything like photojournalism. Both for the sake of letting the world know, what is going on in Sarajevo, that not everything is hunky-dory since the peace was signed, that Sarajevo has tons and tons of, film festivals and other cultural activities, and politicians love to take pictures with Angelina Jolie and so on. But the museums that are repositories of the artifacts and objects that were found in that area for many centuries are precisely the places that witness Bosnia and Herzegovina as multicultural country, where there were periods of great flourishing, like in Spain before expulsion of the Jews, for example, and that there were also periods of strife among the various ethnic groups that very often were orchestrated by somebody of greater power who had interest in these people squabbling while they were making and pillaging, the country. So it almost becomes like a luxury of the museums are simply closed, and when museum is not funded, that means there is no gas, there is no electricity, the pipes are bursting in the walls, the destruction of the war is carrying on. I've talked to curators who haven't been paid, and some of them haven't been paid in 9 months, but they still go to work every day to their cold workplace in order to try and salvage and take care of what is still left. So in that part, in part of the world like Balkans, the museums are important places where people can be reminded that we are not alone here, and many cultures have gone through, and many cultures will go through, and many cultures have lived here together. And the fact that there is no such a reminder is really a blueprint for further conflict and further war. I just got the advance copy from a writer friend in Sarajevo who has written this book of essays that is titled The Future of the Unfinished War, and that is about what is going on in Bosnia right now. The museums have actually important, unifying effect. Museums have an important role, I think, to let us know that things are a little more complex than they seem on the surface right now. Because growing up without access to something like that means that kids in Sarajevo now growing up with this culture. That's not something that exists here. You go to Paris and London and Prague and so on for culture. This here is just the landscape of the war. This is, people don't do anything but squabble here because they don't have evidence, to anything else.
Well, and for a very different reason that, includes poverty and just lack of access in our own area. I mean, I grew up in rural Kentucky and there were not museums there. It's a completely different situation than being in a war-torn country. But I think a lot of people here, there's not that sort of touchstone either. And so you don't have that feedback in terms of cultural importance.
Yes.
And yet, ironically, and I think that Althea's work and Koichi's work really touches upon this, the
I
facts.
would just like to make a very brief point of that, and that is, when people here start talking about defunding culture and defunding NEA, that really gets my ears pricked, because what I'm hearing is, I really want to make people more stupid, because stupid people are easier to manipulate.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, certainly that's something that we're really seeing right now. I mean, ever since the economic downturn in the U.S., museums and arts have been one of the first things that's been cut. And they're so important in terms of nationalism, both in good and bad ways. But also, the thing that I find sort of ironic, and again, I think that all of your all's work touches upon this, but especially also Koichi's and Althea's, is that without the personal and without that sort of, the personal stories that you bring to objects, they also are dead somewhat. So there's that irony that plays itself out in the museum space, and I wonder if you all couldn't speak, a little bit to that, just sort of the bringing of the personal narrative to the museum.
I have to speak, I guess, about this as the relationship with museum and muse from, I guess, maybe an educator perspective, because, I don't know, I guess maybe not so much, I mean, some people might argue that one of the roles of the artist is a very similar role to that of the museum, to record history, right, to challenge history. And so I think there's that, but I know in teaching, it's so important, it becomes so important to me to stress to my students that not all of the inspiration or ideas just come from here, right? And that those ideas can be so much better informed through research and utilizing resources like the museum or like other resources around campus are essential to building knowledge, right? But I mean, we tend not to be we tend not to want to learn or educate through just factual information, right? So, we don't want to just necessarily consume facts, and rather we really, what we tend to do is we tend to actively create knowledge, right? So we have to activate, we have to be physical and doing something in order to really gain and learn from it. And that way, I mean, that's what I love about this exhibit, is that we're taking this factual information and through this interpretation, we're able to give it new voice and then in turn also new relevance given to this factual information, which is so much a part of, I guess, a better understanding who we are and where we're headed and where we've come, just to kind of touch on what Tanja has been talking about, that is the relationship of the museum as also being this record of stories and of personal experiences and ideas and not just objects.
Yeah, right. History of how knowledge was built.
Yes.
With
yes.
all of its problematic aspects.
Right.
I find it interesting that the human nature that we like to collect objects, and there's that attachment, there's something valuable to it. It's not really attachment to the object itself, but the story behind that object. I think that's probably the most important part. That's probably why we collect those objects. Understanding the museum's idea, once the object has been documented and then has a name, and then kept in there, and then it sort of become engraved into the history of humanity. However, this is just the status quo. In the future, this probably will change it. But for instance, if the museum were to disappear, or these objects move around places, or this object may be currently collected in this museum, but in 200 years from now, we will probably collect in different museums, and then go through this little history. And those history will collect us a lot of the stories behind that.
So an example of that is Charles Wilson Peele's museum. After his death, he wasn't able to keep it intact, and P.T. Barnum bought about half of that collection. So, and he certainly built some stories around the objects, and so, you know, the storytelling continues, certainly.
And I think that, you know, and I apologize for not introducing you earlier, Lindsay, but Lindsay Waugh is our academic coordinator here at the McClung Museum, and her position here is to actually be a liaison between faculty and staff and students in the museum. And I think one of the main things that she works on, and that really brings me back to your all's work as well, is using the university museum as a space for creating dialogues and conversation. And I know that, you know, Beauvais, that's something you even wrote an article on in the early 90s. I just recently read, what was it called? I can't remember the title of the article, but
Artistic Freedom in the University?
That's right, Artistic Freedom in the University. And sort of this notion that the museum space can be used for having those types of conversations, can be used to sort of experiment and you know, have interesting interdisciplinary dialogues, or disciplinary dialogues for that matter too. But I was wondering, we sort of had a general overview of museums, but specifically, is there something about working in a university or working in a university museum that's influenced your work in the show, or your body of work in general?
Well, maybe returning to this idea of this sort of public trust in the, you know, we think of the University of Tennessee as having a land grant mission to, you know, record knowledge, create new knowledge, I mean, as Althea was mentioning, so that really I mean, it is interesting to consider the role of the museum. Is it a place where research specialists study objects, or what is its educational and public mission in relationship to the public at large? And certainly the McClung Museum is a repository for objects for specialists to come study, you know, and that's, I mean, that's a centuries-old research museum kind of mission. There's also the very public face of museums, you know, the general education of the public, which we sort of connect to the land grant kind of role of a museum, but making the connection to the actual academic programs, you know, in terms of, I mean, that piece of it, it's exciting to have Lindsay part of the staff here, and I mean, that piece is important. I mean, we have brought our drawing students here to draw particularly from the decorative arts collection and other collections when they're here. I mean, there have been exhibits in the past that have made that connection very strongly between departments and academic programs when an exhibit takes place. So I think that the University Museum has those, it seems to me, threefold kinds of roles. You know, it's there for the specialist who's interested in studying a particular collection. Someone could base their PhD off of materials that are in the collection. It's there for the general public. Sometimes they're in strollers. But then also, I think the exciting one is also, you know, those of us who are in the studio arts, you know, an exhibit like this becomes a great opportunity, I think, to make art that's in response to, and so that, you know, the culture of the museum is a catalyst for creating new culture, you know, and that's exciting.
That's exciting for us too. I mean, I think that one of the the things we had to be open to, and I was really proud of us for, is you said kind of early on, well, maybe not everyone will be very excited about this exhibit because, I mean, literally there could be some skeletons in the closet. And of course, there are a tradition of many artists who literally try and go into museums and pull out skeletons in the closet. I was very excited that staff and our director, Jeff Chapman, were all willing to sort of have some interesting interrogations. And there certainly are some interrogations of some pretty heavy materials, including, race, gender, history, who gets to tell history in the exhibit itself. And then even with Koichi's work, it was interesting because when we first started, that was an object we didn't know much about. And so we thought it was an ancestral figure, and it certainly is modeled after New Guinean ancestral figure, but in actuality, it's a piece of tourist art. And so, you can have conversations about value, and is it still valuable? And I would argue yes, because that particular piece, that community mainly makes tourist art to make their income, and it's a really, really important part of their visual culture and their material culture there. But I think, two of the other interesting conversations that are going on here are the conversations that you all have created that are specifically about, what we value and what gets collected and what doesn't perhaps get collected, or what doesn't get talked about, what doesn't get shown. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that you'd like to share.
What was exciting to me about, I guess, this exhibit was, and in terms of thinking about the university, the relationship of the university and, I guess in the artist role in this case is making, so often we tend to think about the museum as it's like this place that you don't touch things,
Right.
you don't look too close, you might set off an alarm, or, it's not quite accessible, right? And so what was exciting to me was the advantage that we might have here in the university setting to actually go in to the museum and say, want to actually take these things out and be influenced by them and work with them, and so creating more of just the accessibility, and just like creating kind of a relationship with the collection, which allows, I'll speak for myself, which allows me to feel like it is one of my resources, as opposed to it being maybe for serving other purposes, some of these other purposes of the mission of the museum. So that, I think that's of value to me, and then I guess when I think about too, hopefully then for others that would be attending the museum, or maybe other artists that might find interest in awesome objects that they wouldn't have seen before, to think of, like, actually, what else do they have? Maybe it's not just the stuff that's here that they've seen before, but that, maybe there's more that I can mine here, right?
Yeah.
So,
Right, and what other context would these objects be shown in an exhibit? I mean, except but that they were selected through this really kind of eclectic process, right? So there are, I think there are some interesting ones to point out. Like, we could bring up John Rousseau's. John Rousseau started college, he was my mentor at Arizona State, and he started college as a chemistry major. And this one, he writes about in his statement how this official state fossil, that he was so excited that Tennessee had an official state fossil. And in his statement, he affirms the role of science and, a chronology of understanding our planet that is based in science. So here was an artist who put his stake down on science and saying, this is great. In Tennessee, science is important. So it was a political and personal conviction,
Right.
in terms of his choice of that particular object.
Yeah, and if any of you all have other works that you'd like to discuss, I'd love for you to, I'm happy to recall them up. Absolutely. Any works that particularly intrigue you done by other artists in the show?
I think one of which and I'm not going to get wrong, I don't remember all of them.
And she's repeated them. So also feature burial pit, stone pile, and ash pile. And it's just interesting to see how they take on a different meaning whenever they're removed from their original context.
Something that I think is particularly great about this exhibition and being in a university museum, especially at this moment when we're really reaching out to the rest of the university, is it highlights how fluid meaning is. And I think the works in this exhibition are really great at demonstrating that. And that, I think, is one of the key parts of having a university museum, is that it can be this site where the museum can be a place that meaning isn't static.
So
that
it's a laboratory or
objects-
something.
It absolutely is a laboratory. And the objects that are here, students, I can tell them all the time, these are living objects. They can have new life. You can do research on them and change what we know about these objects in our collection. And even having this exhibition where artists are responding to the objects not only gives us new objects, but gives new meaning to the objects that are already in our collection. So I'm very curious to know how you feel about the future life of these works of yours. And how they're kind of going to have a life of their own, just like these objects from the collection did.
Well, we have a room where we keep archives of student work, but there's a lot of portfolios in there. We've been, Koichi, Althea, and I'm sure, and Tanja, we've all been in these kinds of exchange portfolios. And what's the future of them? I like to keep them intact because I see them as kind of time capsules, but I know sometimes they get split up. Like there's even prints in the museum here that have been cut out of larger volumes, right? They were once bound together and then they're separate. But these are all separate in a portfolio. So there are 30 sets of this portfolio. 27 are retained by the artist. The museum has 3 of these sets, so it's interesting what the museum will do with them. Certainly it could make a great traveling show with maybe photo reproductions of some of the work. But my inclination would be to keep my set together, just as a kind of record of the people in this conference. But
Well, and their body works that speak to one another too.
Right.
They're not each made in isolation, I don't think.
Well, I use them as teaching tools. I sometimes will use them as I call it a shock and awe device. When I feel that my students are not kind of rising to their potential. So, okay, guys, let's look at what good prints look like. I teach also at the liberal arts school. So, for example, Beauvais, your prints are prints that I will often show to my philosophy students and to my anthropologists, because I will often teach printmaking classes that are, sort of general requirement art, art classes. And one of the things that are beautiful about those classes is that everybody comes in with something to contribute. Marketing students are, curious to learn, about this grandmother of media, if you will, contemporary media that we are talking about, because that's what printmaking really is. So I find that as artists kind of reach out to other fields of knowledge, and to the sort of vernacular culture and so on, I find that it's a great opportunity to bring in lots of conversations. I think we desperately need to find ways to make art more relevant to everybody, not for the sake of art and artists, but for the sake of complexity in the world, for the sake of good conversations, for the sake of continuation of those stories.
Yeah, well, like the objects, I think the prints in the show are jumping off points for those types of
Exactly.
conversations. Yeah.
Exactly.
And those conversations will be happening in the galleries. We have students from all over campus coming in to do just what you're saying, that these are really sites of exploration for politics, for identity, for economics, for rhetoric. I have a rhetoric professor coming in to look at these objects. They're absolutely going to do just that.
So I'm really excited about this show in part because so many of our colleagues are going to be here in March, and many of them will be artists who have work in the show, and I expect that many of them will be envious. Because the risk that the McClung took to have this show, they're going to say, gosh, I sure wish our museum would do something like this. And I think there was a risk that the McClung Museum took in mounting the show, because they committed to a concept without seeing the resulting works. And in the early conversations, I showed examples of portfolios of this size, ones that included Sid Cross, and the quality of works that they could expect with this show. But it was, it was a real risk that the McClung took, and I hope that, with this kind of programmatic risk, also you see the potential of the kind of innovative things you can do. Of course, it's a risk that's about the McClung Museum itself, so, it has some built-in sort of aspects of it that can make it, hopefully succeed, but anyway, and printmakers tend to be a more organized group, and generally speaking, complete sentences, so that's good too.
It was amazing. Yeah, I didn't know what I was going to get in terms of artist statements, having worked on other shows before, but all of the artist statements, I think if you all have read them upstairs, and I hope you'll take the time to, because they really bring new understanding to the works. Were really amazing and fascinating. And I didn't feel like we were taking a risk just because I felt like we were in good hands. But I think that that's what I hope artists are thinking about a lot of times, and certainly I want us to think about, is risk-taking, because you can't have those interesting conversations and you can't push ideas further if you're not willing to take those risks. And you all took a risk too, without a doubt, every printmaker in the show did. To sort of, devote themselves to this project, especially when so many of you are participating in about 500 other portfolios in anticipation of the conference coming. But it's really been a pleasure. I want to leave some time for you all to mention anything you don't feel like you got to say, that you would like to say. But then I also want to leave at least a couple of minutes for people to ask questions. Yeah, so.
Well, I'd just like to say, you have taken a risk, but that is precisely, to live is to risk, that's what makes it, that's what makes it a living, museum. And I was, talking to Alicia today, and, something that's told to writers in the workshops very often is no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader, that your work has to surprise you. And participating in the portfolios is not, I tend to work in the series, large series, and sort of portfolios are more of a one-off. But some of the most important turns in my work have taken place because of participation in the portfolios and this exchange with artists. How did everybody approach this idea? Well, in this case, we approached different works, but we're still sort of gathered around the fire of McClung collection.
Yeah.
I have a question. The presentation upstairs, it's only done here because you can see the graphic work and the original object mixed together. This format. And potentially, if this portfolio would be shown in other places, would you lend those objects along with?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, some of them have conservation issues that would kind of keep us from traveling them. And it would also depend on where the show would go to, of course, because unfortunately, some university spaces are just absolutely not able to have security or to have other things that we sort of, because we're an AAM accredited, an American Association of Museums accredited museum, we kind of have like a set of rules we have to adhere to. But I think that's a question, that's a good question, and one that we would have as staff. I think that in a lot of ways, the exhibit makes more sense if the real objects are there with it. I think you definitely lose something with photographic reproductions, but it would just be a question of how much people are willing to pay to travel the show too, because traveling, our sandstone effigy figure, which is the state artifact,
Right.
yeah, it would be quite expensive. So they're sort of unfortunately boring logistical conversations that would have to be had.
So that tells you how special this exhibit is, because it's probably only going to happen in this form right now. Certainly then there could be the question of it traveling with photographic representations of the works.
Yeah, that's,
And then you have an interesting sort of question of the prints themselves as a multiple that's
Yeah.
a copy, and then you have a photographic representation. So that could be,
Like Dennis O'Neill's print is one that I can
Yes.
imagine would be a real challenge, which is, yeah, there we go. So it's even looking at it, it's like, it's difficult to know which one was the
It
part of the
is.
collection and
It
which is
is.
the artist's creation. And I like this one because of I guess, in terms of print media, using lithography, using screen print, so really different approaches
Uh-huh.
to achieve something very quite similar. Becomes a question. I know for me, and actually, they're asking about like the lifetime of these prints and what you're going to do, and you use them for like teaching tools and whatnot, but that it'll feel very incomplete not having the objects, like looking
Yeah.
just at the portfolio and going, well,
I know.
okay, like I'm missing a part of the information here,
I thought
right?
about that afterwards. I
So-
was like, I wonder if we should have included the photographic
Photos.
reproductions, even though they sort of, bring Walter Benjamin kind of theory conversations
or
to
an
the
Andrew
fore, but,
Malraux Museum Without Walls. There's one
Exactly.
plate in there that has.
Exactly. Yeah, so, that's perhaps something we could provide the artist with, maybe not, in its beautiful, beautiful lithographic form or something like that, but it's a thought, it's something that I hadn't really considered until recently.
Shall we open it up?
Yeah, does anyone have any questions?
I guess this could be like a broad, like, you go down the lines. Curious, because art does seem like your guys' life to a point. I know you have other things, but could you go down the line and tell me at what age you knew that art was going to be this big in your life? You can start off if you want.
I still don't know. I'm trying to do the best I can do, and I don't know, as long as I can continue, I'll continue. But again, I don't know if that's the only thing I do in my life.
What was the first age you could think of creating something that was considered art? Do you remember?
Considered art? It's like if you go to the beach, just building the sandcastle. I think that was already, I thought, like,
Okay.
I can do this the rest of my life.
Making. Yeah. It's for me, that I didn't know what age, but my father was my first art collector. He used to collect all of my drawings and date them and put them in the special folder that he had. So he had this. Unfortunately, that was all lost because our apartment was shelled and burned. The whole building, in the war, so I don't have it, but he claims that he noticed that I really was into this when I was 4 or so, and I didn't know when does being alone and playing with bottle caps and, making towers out of it, I don't know when that kind of becomes sort of self-conscious, oh, I'm an artist, thing, but I do know that this has to work in addition to this, for me to for things to happen for me. So.
I would say, I guess I was going to say something very similar, that I think for me, I don't really know what age, but but knowing that someone was acknowledging what I was doing as art or as valuable was when I started to recognize it as such, as like, maybe this is something different than, or more than, or important. And that happened at a very young age, but I don't think that awareness or actually acceptance, we'll say that, like the desire to want to make this as art as a significant part of my life, I don't know that happened until much, much later. And I mean, man, I think even when I was in college and studying it, it was still like a kind of like a, I'm in denial, this is what I'm just doing, I just need to graduate, So I think, making that full acknowledgement, that commitment, didn't happen until long, after. It's just something you just keep doing because you feel good doing it, or it feels okay to feel right doing it?
When I was in elementary school with friends, we made a sledding route that went through the woods that I think was a pretty amazing work of art. But probably the high school teacher who told me, really encouraged me to go to a pottery school for 8 weeks when I was 16. Like then, there was someone who really redirected my life. That was absolutely critical. So, that's one of the reasons that I'm very much interested in being an artist and being a teacher, because I know the impact that one person can make on people.
I'm curious where you typically gather your information or gather your inspiration for your work. And if this was like kind of a different experience because you have a list, I understand that you pick from this museum what you're going to do. Is it typically like that, or is it usually just something that you come up with originally?
I know a lot of my initial ideas all came from going to the library, looking at the subject that I thought I was interested in, and then sitting down with a bunch of books and looking through to see what triggered for me. And this is really kind of early on when I was developing interest in exploring identity or exploring concepts of beauty or things like that. And so, I guess in some ways kind of like this where you look at a list and make a selection, right? Based on how you feel about it. In some ways that's, I guess, it was kind of analogous to that, but.
There are lots of sources, your experience, your living the life, books, for me it's very often about reading something that is not necessarily about visual, subjects or subjects of the art, or it can be actually rather abstract, not easily connected to anything that is visual, but I find myself sort of obsessing over thought and realizing I have to scratch this, I have to, get to the bottom of this, and eventually, images begin to percolate. And the other way, when you have been at it for a while, is that you're always looking backwards at the work, and we're never really happy with anything we do, It's always just a reason to do the next thing, Sometimes we have the moment like, okay, I worked hard at this, and it's not a total failure. That is about what an artist will, allow himself or herself to say. But for me, it's looking back and saying, why am I so dissatisfied with this? Where did I want to go deeper? Where did I want to, dig more?
Through the experience in my everyday life, I found some interesting or exciting, and I wanted to share with other people, and I think that's the motive behind it. If I found that object or the topic, whatever I was interested in, I'm hoping there's somebody in the world as interested as I am, and I'm kind of trying to reach out and communicate with these people.
I always go to museums, so much, and I'd be interested in a museum of buttons. I'm just interested in the way museums organize and present material. So, and the zoo is a museum. There were so many different kinds of museums. So I'm always interested in the way narratives or meaning is constructed by museums. So much of what I've been doing is kind of mock museum. So mostly I'll look at books and film and all these are other important resources. But museums themselves are oftentimes what I'm most interested in. So this is a great opportunity, this show, for me, because it is that mining of the museum, essentially.
Tanja Softic, I'd like to get your thoughts on if this kind of project could go kind of mainstream and help areas of cultural conflict like in Eastern Europe, starting with music.
How a project like this could be used.